Cahill, I have to apologise for talking to my colleague while other speakers were speaking, because I had to try and work out if we had somehow, Deputy Lennon had somehow inserted an amendment into the legislation that we were going to make electric vehicles mandatory. Of course, we're not doing that, but the speakers who've spoken beforehand have spoken in a way that in many ways they're outlining exactly what the challenges are. There is a shortage of electric vehicles. They are expensive. There is no second-hand market. It is incredibly difficult for people who are struggling with the cost of living to try and deal with making decisions that are carbon neutral. But my understanding of both the amendments and the broader commitment in the programme for government is they're the challenges we're trying to meet, rather than using them as an excuse to say that we don't want to have change. And I know a lot of people in this House talk about agreeing with that climate change is a factor, but you know, we know all human activity has an impact on the planet. We want to be able to drive from Dublin to Kerry, and we want to be able to do that when fossil fuels are gone. We want to continue to be able to have the type of lifestyles that we have and reduce the impact on the planet. Over 200 years, we have effectively taken all of the sea creatures and vegetation that took millions of years to distill down into oil, that the planet distilled down into oil, and in the space of 200 years, we've burned it all. And we've put it all up in our atmosphere, and it's going to run out. And when that happens, we want to keep driving to Kerry. So we have to find a different way of doing it. And one of the ways of doing it is with electronic vehicles, and I've no doubt that humankind will have other ways of meeting that challenge too. And so the amendment, my understanding of the amendment is, and of the broader point that the Minister is making, is that infrastructure is key to that. And Deputy McGrath talks about the lack of infrastructure, and he's right. And that's not a reason for us not to have electric vehicles, it's a reason for us to have better infrastructure. Now, the amendment itself actually speaks about favouring other versions of low carbon travel other than electric vehicles. You might have missed the irony of the contributions, because it talks about things like electric cycling and e-scooters and so on, and including them in the scope, not just electric vehicles. So actually, I think you should be voting for the amendment, because you're actually encouraging us to encourage us to concentrate on things other than. Yeah, it will allow us to the legislation will allow us, and the amendment will allow us to focus on things other than electric vehicles. So I look forward to you supporting the amendment on that basis. On that idea of the infrastructure minister, it's crucially important that we get the infrastructure in place so that people do have the confidence to be able to make the switch. And it will be a very difficult switch. The cost aside, although that is a very significant factor, the infrastructure is going to be crucially important. I particularly welcomed when you came out to Finglas there a couple of weeks ago, where Dublin City Council installed a new mobility hub, which included charging points for electric bikes, for electric cars, and a bike sharing scheme by ESB. I suppose a publicly funded project, but we need to see far more of them. And I suppose because the council land is owned, because the site is owned by the council, in some ways we're taking public space away to provide this facility, and I understand that, but we also have to look at private infrastructure providers as well. And there are many petrol stations that I think could accommodate more charging points in urban areas, and in suburban areas. There's a petrol station very close to me that no longer does car washing and has the equivalent of 14 or 15 car parking spaces that lie there pretty much idle most of the time, and again could provide the infrastructure for e-charging. We need to look at the infrastructure for those people who don't have driveways. You know, many people want to have the installation of a socket where they can plug the car in, but in doing that it would drape across a public footpath, and that we know wouldn't be satisfactory. So we need to get better at making sure that the regulations around how that is done, the interaction with the local authority and so on is reduced, and we need to put more supports in place for our for our local authorities to continue, I thought, which was a very good scheme that you opened in Finglas. Now, Minister, the legislation also deals with the issue of scrambler bikes. It takes a very strong line on how they should be dealt with, given the Gardaí's increased powers, ensuring that the bikes can be seized from the curtilage of the property, bringing in a new classification of vehicles and so on. And that's really, really welcome. As a first-time TD, it's a bit soul-destroying that you at Cabinet, and along with the Taoiseach and others, agreed that in January 2021, and that we have not yet passed the legislation through the House. So I encourage you to continue doing that, because it will make a life-changing impact. And deputies across the House, and I see deputies here from Sinn Féin, but I know deputies from Fine Gael, from Labour, from all parties, acknowledge that we need to take strong action on scrambler bikes, and I really welcome it. What I don't want to see, Minister, is e-scooters, which I think are a very good low-carbon option when used properly in cycling lanes within the network, replacing the antisocial behaviour that happens on scrambler bikes. And we do regularly see outside schools, in our local villages, e-scooters being used on public pavements. And it'd be, I suppose, disappointing that in one breath we close the door on the scrambler bike antisocial behaviour, and that we don't do enough to tackle the antisocial behaviour that arises from e-scooters. So I think some of it will be a Garda matter. I know there are limitations in this bill that talk about responsible use of e-scooters, but I would ask you to press on the Minister for Justice to ensure that the Gardaí, as well as getting additional powers from on the issue of scramblers, that they also implement the obligations that e-scooter drivers will have in this legislation. As I say, this is about giving people more options to allow them to have a lower impact carbon on the planet. We need to have politicians, I've said it before in this House, that are climate brave, people that are willing to say things that sometimes might be unpopular, or you might need to lead people on. And I certainly think some of the contributions here today, Cathaoirleach, were more about scaring people about electric vehicles than actually providing the infrastructure which we know all needs to be done.